Hey guys, welcome back. So in part one, we talked about what are things you want to do or what are things that you should expect before going into the world of CNA. In part two, I'm going to talk about how to have a successful shift and what are things that you want to do to save yourself some time or things that will help you become eventually a good multitasker in the world of CNA. In this video, I'm going to talk about several things. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks as to how I tend to go about my day, and also what are the time frames in a 24-hour period, and what are some of the most important things that takes place in those hours. Let's just say you're working at a hospital. Things that you want to be aware of is in the hospital, every single unit is different, and with that said, their routine is also different. Some of them can vary a lot and some of them can vary just a little bit. So that's why I always suggest asking whoever working there, what are their routines like? And second of all, you want to know if nurses do vitals in the morning or CNAs do vitals in the morning. Because in the morning, nurses tend to do their assessment around 7 a.m. And during this time, nurses tend to also take the patient's vitals. But sometimes nurses do get really hung up and they don't get to do the vitals on time. So what you want to do is either A, look up on their chart to see whether by 9 o'clock per se, if the patient's vitals are in. If not, you want to take that patient's vitals. At other times, it could be the other way around. Some units, it is the CNA that do all the vitals. So you want to ask whether nurses do vitals in the morning or CNAs do vitals in the morning. And a big one also is that you always want to get a report from either the nurses or the CNAs. But of course, there are times where that could be a little bit hard due to circumstances. So I am going to give you some tricks as to things that I definitely look out for in charting, and some of the things I tend to look out for as far as signage goes to make sure that even in this case of not having any information, I know what to do on my shift. So there are 4 things that I definitely look out for. One is vital signs, one is mobility, one is isolation, and the last one is nutrition. So these are the 4 main things that I want to look out for to give me a good summary as to what that patient is like. So first of all is vital signs. Vital signs I want to look out for is what are the time frames that this patient needs to have their vitals taken. Is it every 4 hours? Is it every 8 hours, TID? Or is it every 2 hours, depending on what the patient's condition is at the time? This is important because this could really save you a lot of time. You don't want to be taking vital signs in the afternoon if a patient does not need to have their vitals taken, because that way you could be doing something else, say most likely bathing or cleaning somebody up. There are 2 ways you could find this information. The first one is under patient order. Under patient order, you will find a lot of good information as to what this patient needs to get done during that day. So such as vital signs, blood sugar checks, or labs. Another one is just simply looking at the time frames when this patient's vital signs were taken. So you could backtrack and try to figure out what are the duration that the patient's vitals need to be taken. And you can also look at when's the last time the patient's vitals were taken. So if, say, a vital sign is overdue, you could go and take that vital sign check. And next up, number 2 is mobility. In mobility, I want to look out for, just very simply, is the patient ambulating or are they bed rest? Based on this information, it can give me a lot of good information. So say if the patient's bed rest, most likely they're dependent, and if they're dependent, I'm guessing they need a lot of help. And with that said, they most likely need to be turned every 2 hours. I'm thinking most likely they're going to be a feeder, possibly. I'm thinking most likely they're incontinent, and most likely they may have a drain or 2, depending on what the patient status is. So with that said, I know to make sure I look at other aspects of their charting to look out for those things to see whether that is in line with my train of thought. Now, knowing this information can actually save you a lot of time. And the reason for it is you know to either possibly order the patient's food, you know to maybe expect the patient's tray to come in soon, or you may have to feed the patient the moment you go in, depending on whether the patient's trays have already arrived. And at the same time, you know to possibly look out whether the patient has been turned recently. And if not, you could turn that patient the first time you go in. So this way, your first trip, you save yourself time from going back and forth, even simply just to reposition a patient down the line, maybe say another half hour or so. Another way you save yourself time is knowing if the patient is incontinent or not. you could already check this patient to see whether they're soiled this first time that you go in. So you tackle a lot of aspects just from knowing these information and having yourself prepared for that. Let's just say the patient's ambulating. How steady is this patient? Is this patient very steady, in which I don't have to worry too much? Or is this patient somewhat unsteady and I need to be on guard with them? Or if this patient is very unsteady and very high fall risk, then most likely I shouldn't get them out of bed at all. So let's just say they're unsteady. If they're unsteady on their feet, there are things I'm going to be looking out for. Do they use a walker, a cane, steady, right? For those who could only tolerate standing for such a short period of time before they need to sit again. And do this patient have a commode at the bedside? So depending on how far this patient can walk, let's just say they're ambulating 10 feet or more, I'm probably going to anticipate this patient to be using the bathroom. Let's just say if the patient is walking less than 10 feet, I'm probably going to anticipate a commode either in the room, or I'm going to make sure it's in the chart before I go in, so I know that there is a commode at the bedside. So in the case that if a patient calls me right away, I know to look out for the commode so they could be toileted the right way. Number 3 is nutrition. In nutrition, I'm going to be looking out for several things. First one is this patient a feeder or non-feeder? If this patient is a feeder, I'm going to be making sure that once the tray arrives, I'm going to feed the patient. Or if the patient's tray has not been ordered, I'm going to have to order that tray right away. Another criteria I'm going to be looking out for is this patient on any blood glucose check? Or do they need any insulin? This is important because once the patient's tray arrives, you want to make sure the patient has gotten their blood glucose check and they have their insulin given before you give them their tray. Otherwise, this patient can have a high spike in blood glucose, and we do not want that. So we want to contact the nurses or check the charting to see whether this blood glucose check has been done. And with that said, your carb-controlled diets are the ones that definitely need blood glucose checks. These are the ones that are most likely your diabetics. So they're the ones that are on insulin regimens. Another type of nutrition is tube feedings. Is this patient on an NG tube, or they have some sort of gastric tube or NG tube, gastric jejunostomy tube that it stands for? Or this patient is on TPN, in which is an IV form of nutrition. And knowing that, I'm going to be looking out for whether this patient is strictly IV nutrition or this patient have some sort of a supplement regimen in which they're able to get some sort of a PO intake. And with that, I know to anticipate that their supplements would be arriving and that I could still give that to them. Or they're completely NPO. Next up is NPO. NPO, there is the very, very strict NPO, which is the one in which you absolutely cannot give them anything through their mouth. And with that said, this is important because let's just say the patient has a surgery that day. In this case, this patient is definitely a strict NPO. I'm not going to be giving them anything because there is a chance for this patient to be aspirating in surgery if I gave them anything. Or if I did give them anything, I need to make sure that the nurses and doctors are noted right away so they could delay their surgery to make sure that they are properly NPO'd. Going off of that note, let's just say the patient is anticipating surgery. I want to know whether this patient's chlorhexidine bed bath has been done. And if not, what time frame is the surgery at? And based on this, I'm going to make sure that the chlorhexidine bed bath is done about an hour to 2 before the surgery time so that this person is disinfected prior to surgery. Not only that, depending on which hospital, which unit you're working on, some require the CNA to actually find the mode of transportation for the patient to go into surgery. Is this patient going through a wheelchair or is they going in through their beds? If so, then you're the one that are in charge of getting that set up so that the patient can go in there on time. So there's a lot that CNAs do in the morning. It can get really hectic. On the list, number 4 is isolation. Now, this one is a big one right now because due to COVID-19, we want to make sure that we are going to the patient's room in full gear if the patient is on COVID. Say if the patient's not so severe and they're just on some sort of a flu, we want to know that and we're just simply a surgical mask to protect ourselves. And say if the patient's not on droplet and they're on contact. If they're on contact, what type of contact are they on? Are they on C. diff? This one is a big one because we know that we cannot simply use hand sanitizer to sanitize our hands. We have to make sure we scrub our hands and wash our hands in order to get C. diff off. And the last one is airborne. In airborne, if the patient is on TB most of the time, then we definitely need the airborne precaution, which is the N95 mask going in. Now, simply knowing the patient on isolation not only guarantees my safety, but it could also save me some time. And the reason why is most of the time these patients tend to be less frequently visited. So their pitcher of water tends to be empty because nobody really knows it. What I tend to do is before going in, I would fill up a pitcher of water before going in. This way, not only do I save going in there a second time and exposing myself, but at the same time, most likely patients will be very happy when they see that you're attentive to their needs. Also, staff would be really appreciative if you don't have to bother them to get you supplies while you're in an isolation room. So overall, you save yourself time from waiting for the staff, you save yourself time from going there a second time, and at the same time, patients are satisfied. Other things to know with the isolation room is I'm going to be checking out for food trays. Is the food tray at the nurse's station or still at the kitchen? And if it is, I'm going to be bringing that in as well while I'm walking over to the patient's room, so that once I am all gowned up, I have the food tray in my hand before walking in. Another thing I'm going to be looking out for once I am in the patient's room is also doing a check to see whether this patient has any drainage or lines that I need to take care of. And if so, I'm going to drain those out as well. So I save myself more time by not having to go in there again later on to empty these drains. So a small recap to isolation room. This is an example as to what I would do for a patient. I'm going to check the patient's food tray to see if there's any food tray at the nurse's station or at the kitchen. I'm also going to be bringing a full pitcher of water before I'm going in. Once I am in the patient's room, depending on what time frame it is, I'm going to be checking the patient's vitals. I could be either repositioning a patient if they needed it. I'm also going to check their drainage to see if I need to drain any drains. And lastly, I'm going to be checking is whether this patient is clean or soiled. If so, I'm going to be calling for backup now to make sure I have supplies to clean this patient. This way, I clutter all the patient's care before leaving, and at the same time, I don't have to make a second or third trip just simply going back and forth doing these things. Up to this point, I covered the top 4 categories of bare minimums that I should be noting prior to even moving a patient. Other aspects that I should note are lines and drains. Lines and drains such as whether this patient has an IV, PICC line, JP drains, hemovac, wound vac, Foley catheter, etc. Now this is important because nursing assistants are responsible for draining drainages, but at the same time, it gives them an idea as to what are the restrictions and limitations to the patient. If the patient has JPs, how many JPs do this patient have? And knowing how many, I need to make sure that I drain all of them before my shift ends. Another thing is also noting the location of the drain. So this way, if there is one hidden, you know where to find it. Because sometimes underneath these patients' gowns, it's hard to find where certain things are placed. If the patient has IVs, which side of the IVs is it? And is it running? If the IV is running, then I need to make sure that if the patient is using the bathroom, for example, I'm going to unplug that IV pole before the patient goes to the bathroom. And at the same time, I know which side the patient probably get off of bed based on that information. Another line was PICC. PICC is a very special line that goes to the center of the heart from most likely the antecubital site. And with this, we have to make sure that the patient's blood pressure check cannot be on that side. Now, going back to tube feeding, I'm going to consider this also a line because it is. And with that, I'm going to know whether this patient's NG tube is running. If it's running, I need to make sure the head of the bed of this patient is not all the way down. They're not supine. Instead, they're somewhat raised up, and this prevents aspiration. Also, does this patient have an epidural line per se? If they have an epidural line, it's going to be in the back, and I'm going to be very careful moving this patient to make sure that this does not rip out in any way, because that is to control the patient's pain. If the patient's pain is not managed properly, these patients can get very agitated and their vital signs can also go out of whack. So it's very important that I note lines and drains so I know how to properly move these patients. If the patient's NG tube or tube feedings are running and I need to move the patient, I'm going to have to make sure this patient's tube feeding are paused before I move the patient so that they don't run the risk of aspiration. Another category I kind of touch base on is restrictions. So is this person having a PICC line restriction for blood pressure? Does this person have a restriction in which they could only be in supine? Does this patient have a fluid restriction? So with fluid restrictions, you want to make sure that you communicate with the nurse and see what is the method that they've been doing to keep track of the patient's intake. And that way you could chart it accordingly as well. And also you could give an accurate report for whoever is coming into next shift. Another thing to know is, say if the patient had a hip surgery. In hip surgery, we want to make sure we move the patient in only certain position, because there's quite a bit of restriction as to how these patients can move because it's in the hip area. We want to make sure we keep the hips aligned and therefore we don't cross their legs in any way. We also want to make sure that we don't bring their knees up to the chest or make any 90-degree angle. That way it can potentially pop out their hips again. So most of the time you will see these patients with a wedge in between their legs to make sure that their legs are aligned with their hips. I'm actually going to give you guys an example to a unit that is similar to your med-surg units, but in reality it's a little bit different, and that's bone marrow transplant units. And this is because in bone marrow transplant units, the patient population tends to be very vulnerable. Most of the time they are on neutropenic precautions due to the fact that they don't have a good immune system to defend themselves in that regard. So what we tend to do for bone marrow transplant patients is that we have strict antibacterial bed baths, and also we try to get rid of all the bacteria in the mouth as much as possible. So in that regard, we tend to give patient in these units a lot of oral rinses, a lot of oral care to make sure that it keeps flushing out their mouth. Also with antimicrobial baths, we tend to use this pink solution that is called Hibiscus. Now, on the flip side, the good thing about bone marrow transplant units is that patients tend to be a lot more able, so they are able to take care of themselves a lot easier, and we don't have to be so hands-on. So what we do is that instead of having to help the patient with every little thing, we could set them up for the day, and whenever the patient decides to take care of themselves, they have all the supplies in their reach. So what I tend to do in the beginning of my day is that I would grab, say, like a towel, a gown, or in some maybe washcloths, and then I'll set it off to the patient's bedside. And that way, when the patient decides to take a bath or do any type of care, it's within their reach. Another thing about these units is that we have to make sure that they constantly rinse their mouth because we're trying to get rid of as much bacteria as possible. You can also keep track of how many times the patient does oral rinse. I tend to do like these check boxes on the whiteboard, and I would check each time the patient does it. Or throughout the day, I'll ask the patient, oh, how many times have you done this from, say, like 12 to 3 or something. And therefore, I am able to document accordingly in my charting to make sure that these patients are doing the oral care. Big point to know for your patients is your patients discharging, or is there anybody admitting that day during your shift? And this is important because you want to know that in the beginning of your shift so you can prep the patient accordingly. So say the patient is discharging, you want to make sure that they're dressed. You want to make sure that they have all their belongings before they leave so the hospital does not have to get in trouble for that. And in order to do so, you have to make sure what kind of time frame the patient may be discharging, and therefore you can get all their supplies ready for them. Save the patient's admitting. What are things you want to prep for? Well, you want to know what the patient's here for. Do they have a suicidal precaution that we have to be aware of? And if so, we want to make sure all their cords in the rooms are removed. If the patient does not have suicidal precaution, you want to just regular setup is you want to give them a blood pressure cuff. You want to set up a pulse ox in the room. And you want to make sure they have toiletry supplies such as tissues, toothbrush, soaps, deodorant, etc. I'm gonna go back and actually give you a 24-hour period as far as things that tends to take place to an hour. So for example, around 7, that's when you come on your shift, you get your report. You want to make sure that if you don't get your report, you want to at least check the charting and see what are some of these things that I talked about before and note it. Afterwards, you're going to go into the patient's room and do your introduction. You're going to probably bring them supplies, give them a fresh pitcher of water. And depending on the protocol, you may also take the patient's vital signs right from the get-go. If the nurses roll, most likely you're going to back off from that. However, I would suggest is that if you're able to do the vital signs for a nurse, when you're in there, nurses will love you for it, and it gives you brownie points for the day. Otherwise, say if you're really busy, then of course you're probably going to skip that step. In addition, I'm going to also make sure that if there is a weight that I need to take care of, I could probably do that right at that time as well, unless the patient is still sleepy. Of course, we don't want to wake them up to take that weight right away. We want to make sure they're more awake and then get them on the scale. Or if they're on the way to the bathroom, that's when we grab the scale and then bring it to their room to make sure we get that set up before they go back to bed. 7 to 8, you're still probably doing vital signs for some patients. You're probably still taking weights for some patients. In other times, you're probably going to be feeding a patient depending on what it is that the patient is coming in here for and what their conditions are like. Otherwise, you're probably also going to be ordering food depending on what time frame this is and how settled you are for the day as well. 8 to 9, this time period, I tend to hold off whatever I want to do later, just because around 8 to 9, it gets really hectic for patients. Nurses tend to come in with meds, and also doctors tend to do visits for some. At the same time, it's just not really convenient for you to be there. And so around this time, I would probably continue my feedings for some patients. And other times, I may take my early break in the beginning, my first break, if I have to. Other times, if I do have the time to, I would probably start offering care, such as asking patients if they want to wash their mouth or if they need supplies to get ready for the day. Going back to break. For break, it tends to range from 8:30 to 10:30 for your first break. And depending on what the protocol and what the hospital unit is like, you're either going to take a 15-minute or 30-minute break in that first break. Now, from 10 to 11, this is when you're a little bit more free. You're able to have time to ambulate patients, or you're going to offer care continuously for those who need it. Other times, you may start offering second vital signs. Usually it's from starting about 10:30 and up until 11 to 12, around this range. This is when you do your afternoon vitals for patients. So around this time frame as well, I also suggest when you take the patient's vital sign, afterwards you check patient's drains as well. This is a good time for you to start documenting those I's and O's for patient. In addition, once it hits around 12, that is when patients start to have their lunch. So you want to check to see whoever does not have their orders in, you want to remind patients to either order them, or you're going to help with ordering their food, or you're going to probably be helping with patients feeding. 12 to 1:30, you want to make sure that you are planning out your care accordingly so that it does not interrupt your own lunch break. And usually this is around a 30-minute break. And at the same time, you're going to be breaking off each other on the floor for CNAs, if there is 2 CNAs on the floor, or maybe even 3. So you want to make sure that you stick to your own time so that you don't interrupt another person's time to go on their break. Now, depending on the hospital and the unit, from around 2 to 3, this is when you take your last break for those who have taken a 15-minute break during your first time, or you have no breaks, and during this time you're going to continuously offering care, cleaning patients, bathing, oral care, etc. And for some, you also want to check in to see if they have any discharges. Usually this is around the time they may also discharge. So we want to make sure that discharging patients have all their supplies ready for them and that they're dressed and ready to go. And once around 3 o'clock hits, this is when you're done for the day shift. You're going to be giving reports to the next shift CNAs, or you're going to be reporting any findings as well to nurses that you want them to note of. Now it's on to evening shift from around 3 to 11. During this time, it's a little bit more free in comparison to the day shift. It's not as hectic. People tend to be leaving for work. There's no doctors to interrupt as much. And so during this time from around 3 o'clock, the only thing you're more busy of is your 4-hour vital signs check again. So for patients who are on every 4-hour continuous vital sign checks, you can be doing that. First break, I would say is probably around 3:30 to maybe 5:30, depending on when you want that first break. And so this is when, again, you want to make sure you just communicate with the team to let them know that you're going on your break. Usually there's no problem with going on this break because people tend to be a little bit more settled in for the day. Around 4:30 to 5:30, depending on when you're coming back from your break, you want to check in to make sure patients have their food, they have their orders in, and that for whoever who needs feeding, you're going to be helping out with feeding. From about 5:30 to 8:30, this is when staff tends to go on dinner break. So you want to make sure you know who is on break and you cover their patients according to who is going on their breaks. In between this time frame, nurses tend to be leaving and the next shift nurses are coming in. Usually this takes place around 7 o'clock. So you're going to be covering a lot more call lights if there's call lights that are coming in. And you also want to make sure that this is also another time frame where you can help out with vital signs if you have the time to do so, because nurses tend to get report and it takes them a while to get all that settled in. And kind of similar to the morning shift, around 8 to 9, this is when nurses start passing their meds. So it gets pretty hectic for patients because patients tend to either have their assessment done and then meds done around this time. So this is when you want to be a little bit more cautious as to how much you go into the patient's room or how much you want to interrupt the nurses. From 9 to 10, this is when you're probably going to take your last break for some of you, either a 15 minutes or a 30-minute break. And during this time, you're probably going to be a little bit more free now that patients are starting to slow down and that they're probably going to sleep soon. Lastly, I've reached the final hour. It is 11 o'clock. You're free to go. So usually you either give reports to CNAs for the night shift if there is a night shift CNA. If there isn't, then you're probably going to report to the nurses to let them at least know that you're leaving for the night. Now that I've finished covering hospital CNA, let's talk about skilled nursing facility or nursing homes and what some of the things that we need to be cautious of as CNAs. Now in nursing home, there are a lot more residents, and so you're busy most of the time with actually just getting through to everybody. Once you receive a report for the day, you want to start going around and taking care of either their breakfast trays that you need to press out for, or you want to start feeding residents for those who need it. And this will take some time. And depending on how short-staffed their nursing home is, this can be very time pressing. A tip that I learned from nursing home training when I had my clinical is that because of how short-staffed they tend to be, so what the CNAs tend to do is they would mix their food up in that they're making sure that they're still able to provide these residents with somewhat of a balanced nutrition, even though it is not that balanced, to be honest. And so that is one thing you want to consider, is that your time is very pressed. One thing I learned from SNFs is that because they're just so short staffed, they do not have the manpower to get 2 people to always help with cleaning. And so what happens is that they tend to double up on chucks and diapers and briefs in order to make sure that these patients are kept clean and that they do not need to rely on a second person to do it for them, because sometimes that's just not the case for every single one. Alright guys, so that's all the tips I have for you today as far as how you can have a successful shift as a brand new CNA. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below and make sure to like and subscribe for this channel for more information. Also, I'm going to be coming out with a new video next time on how to have a successful shift for psych nursing specifically, because psych nursing is such a rare breed. If you have any more questions, of course, you can also always comment down below and I will try to reply to as many of your questions as possible. Also, I have an Instagram page, so you can make sure to follow me on there and you could message me as well. And that way, not only do I get to know you guys a little bit better, but at the same time, I can continuously help you guys out. All right, that's it. Bye.